For 6 months, Mwangi believed he had found something real, something that gave meaning to his otherwise quiet and predictable days. Every night, after the noise of the day faded and the coastal air of Malindi grew still, his phone would light up with messages from Sarah in Chicago. The glow of the screen became a familiar comfort in the darkness, bridging an ocean and multiple time zones. Their conversations stretched late into the night, often long after one of them should have been asleep. Yet neither seemed willing to let the connection end. They talked about everything and nothing, small daily experiences, personal dreams, fears they had never shared with anyone else, and a future that felt vivid despite never being truly lived. Sarah would describe her life in Chicago in detail, mentioning the cold mornings, the busy streets, the pressure of work, and her desire to see the world beyond what she knew. Mwangi in return shared the quiet beauty of Kenya's coast, the rhythm of the ocean, and the way light fell differently over Malindi's red dust roads. She admired his photography, often telling him that his images made her feel as if she were already there, while he admired her curiosity about a world so different from his own. Together they built a bond that felt deeply personal, even intimate, though it existed entirely through screens and carefully timed messages. Over time, their conversations stopped feeling like casual exchanges and started feeling like shared life moments. They spoke of visiting each other, of meeting in person, of what it would feel like to finally close the distance that had defined their relationship. Those promises, repeated often enough, began to feel inevitable rather than uncertain. But what felt like love online was about to be tested in a way neither of them had truly prepared for. Because the moment Sarah stepped off the plane into Malindi, the carefully constructed world had built through messages, calls, and imagination began to shift in ways that were impossible to ignore. And neither Mwangi nor Sarah was ready for what real life would reveal when the screen was no longer there to soften the differences between them. The afternoon sun hung heavily over the red dust roads of Malindi, casting a warm golden haze over the quiet coastal town. Outside a small beachfront cafe, Mwangi stood still as if time itself had slowed down around him. The ocean was close enough to hear, waves rolling in softly, folding into the shore with a steady rhythm. But he barely registered it. His mind was elsewhere, locked on the phone in his hand, where he kept refreshing the screen for updates that never arrived. For 6 months, Sarah had lived inside that device. She was a voice that appeared at night when everything was quiet, a face that lit up his screen during late calls that stretched across continents. Their conversations had become part of his routine. Yet in all that time, she had never existed in his physical world. No shared spaces, no real presence, only distance, imagination, and carefully constructed moments of connection. And still, he had trusted it. He had trusted her. Today was supposed to change everything. Mwangi adjusted his linen shirt again, smoothing it down out of nervous habit than necessity. He tried to steady his breathing, to appear composed, but his thoughts refused to settle. Each passing minute stretched longer than the last, filled with quiet anticipation and a growing tension he could not fully explain. Around him, life continued normally. Locals walking past, distant conversations blending with the sound of the sea, waiters moving between tables with practiced ease. No one seemed aware that for him, this moment carried something heavier than it appeared. Then, without warning, a taxi slowly pulled up near the cafe, its tires crunching lightly against the dusty ground. Sarah stepped out of the taxi with hurried energy, pushing the door open before the driver had even fully stopped the vehicle. The warm coastal air of Malindi rushed around her immediately, carrying the scent of salt, dust, and the distant ocean. Large sunglasses covered part of her face, and one hand tightened around her designer handbag, while the other quickly brushed loose strands of hair away from her forehead. She looked exactly like the woman Mwangi had spent months speaking to through glowing phone screens late at night. The same blonde hair, the same confident posture, the same polished appearance. Yet standing there in real life, something about her presence felt unfamiliar. Before Mwangi could fully take in that moment, Sarah's attention scattered in every direction at once. Her eyes moved quickly across the busy roadside, the motorcycles weaving through traffic, the street vendors calling out in the distance, and the intense coastal sunlight reflecting off nearby buildings. The heat immediately overwhelmed her. She exhaled sharply, fanning herself with one hand while speaking rapidly about the long journey from Mombasa and the exhausting traffic along the highway. Her voice carried frustration beneath the excitement, as though the reality of Kenya had arrived too suddenly and too intensely for her expectations. Mwangi stood quietly in front of her, trying to absorb the reality that she was finally there after 6 months of emotional conversations, late-night laughter, and carefully built intimacy. He smiled softly, hoping to calm the tension he sensed in her body language. There was kindness in the way he looked at her, the kind that came from genuine anticipation and emotional investment. But while he focused on the significance of finally meeting, Sarah seemed more consumed by the environment itself. The heat on her skin, the noise around her, the unfamiliar movement of life unfolding outside the taxi window. As they walked toward the cafe, the contrast between them became impossible to ignore. Mwangi moved with calm familiarity, greeting people casually and adjusting naturally to the slow rhythm of the coast. Sarah, however, moved with urgency, her attention constantly shifting between her phone, her surroundings, and the discomfort she was trying to manage. Even in those few minutes together, it became clear that they were stepping into the same moment from two completely different worlds. One of them felt deeply rooted in the place around them, while the other already seemed emotionally distant from it, as though she were only passing through an experience she had imagined very differently online. At lunch by the ocean, the atmosphere around them felt almost perfect. The salty breeze drifted gently through the open restaurant as waves rolled lazily against the shore nearby. Tourists laughed in the distance. Soft coastal music played from hidden speakers, and waiters moved calmly between tables carrying plates of seafood and cold drinks. Mwangi had imagined this exact moment many times during their late-night conversations, finally sitting across from Sarah in real life, watching her experience the beauty of the Kenyan coast he loved so deeply. But beneath the peaceful setting, he began sensing a quiet disconnect growing between them. Sarah moved through the lunch casually, barely slowing down long enough to absorb the environment around her. Her attention constantly shifted between her phone, the ocean view, and the small details she wanted to capture for social media. To her, the experience felt light and temporary, almost like another beautiful stop in a larger adventure. To Mwangi, however, the moment carried emotional weight and meaning far beyond photographs or videos. When the bill finally arrived, Sarah reached into her purse without hesitation and placed a crisp $100 bill onto the tray, casually telling the waiter to keep the change. The waiter's eyes widened for a brief second before he thanked her repeatedly and walked away in disbelief. Mwangi immediately felt tension settle in his chest. It was not the generosity itself that bothered him, but the way it was given so casually without understanding what such an amount represented in this place. He gently tried explaining that Mary carried a different kind of impact here, that leaving such a large tip could unintentionally create unrealistic expectations and imbalance. But Sarah brushed the concern aside with a small laugh, insisting she was simply being kind, that it was not a big deal. As the conversation faded, Mwangi quietly stared toward the ocean, realizing something important. For the first time since Sarah arrived, he understood that they were not just two people learning about each other. They were two completely different perspectives colliding in ways neither of them had expected. One afternoon, the tension between them deepened during a planned coastal tour. A local guide they had hired arrived nearly 40 minutes late after his motorbike broke down on the highway outside Malindi. Before the man could even fully explain himself, Sarah's frustration exploded openly. She criticized the situation harshly, calling it disorganized and unprofessional, her voice carrying across the small gathering near the beach. The guide stood there quietly, visibly embarrassed, while Mwangi felt a wave of discomfort rise inside him. It was not the delay that hurt him most, but the way Sarah failed to see the reality around her. In Kenya, unexpected setbacks were part of everyday life, and people often survived through patience, improvisation, and understanding. Mwangi tried gently explaining that things did not always move with perfect precision, especially in smaller towns where life followed a different rhythm. But Sarah struggled to understand that flexibility here was not weakness or incompetence. It was simply how people adapted to circumstances beyond their control. In that moment, Mwangi realized the growing distance between them was no longer about personality differences. It was about two completely different ways of seeing the world. Friday evening was meant to be meaningful. Mwangi had invited Sarah to meet his family in Mombasa. His mother had spent the entire day preparing traditional meals, carefully and lovingly, as a gesture of respect and welcome. In his culture, food was more than nourishment. It was a form of connection, identity, and hospitality. But Sarah arrived later than expected, having spent much of the afternoon focused on capturing content and documenting her experience. When she finally entered the home, the atmosphere was warm and hopeful. Smiles were offered, hospitality was extended. Yet her attention immediately shifted to the food in front of her, not with appreciation, but with concern. She questioned its preparation, its safety, and its suitability for her diet, expressing hesitation in the way that disrupted the emotional tone of the room. The warmth that had filled the space slowly faded. Mwangi's mother lowered her gaze, and the excitement of the evening dissolved into silence. Mwangi felt something deep inside him tighten. It was not anger alone, but disappointment layered with embarrassment and emotional conflict. What was meant to be a moment of connection had turned into something entirely different. The drive back to Malindi felt unbearably heavy, as though the silence inside the car had become its own living presence. The road stretched endlessly ahead beneath the dim glow of passing streetlights, while the distant sound of ocean wind occasionally slipped through the slightly open windows. No conversation came between them anymore. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine, the tires brushing against the rough road, and the faint rattling of loose gravel beneath the car. Mwangi kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. His eyes fixed ahead, but his mind replayed the dinner over and over again. The warmth and pride he had felt while bringing Sarah into his family's home had now been replaced by disappointment he could not fully explain. He wanted to say something, to somehow repair the tension hanging between them, but every possible word felt too small for what they had already broken. Beside him, Sarah sat quietly against the window, staring into the darkness outside as villages, streetlights, and empty stretches of road passed by in silence. Her expression carried exhaustion more than emotion, as though she had mentally removed herself from the evening long before it ended. The excitement that once filled their late-night video calls now felt painfully distant, almost unreal compared to the comfortable silence surrounding them. For the first time since they met, both of them were beginning to understand that emotional connection alone could not erase the deeper differences between their worlds. What once felt effortless through phone screens and carefully chosen conversation was now struggling under the weight of reality, culture, expectations, and misunderstanding. And somewhere between Mombasa and Malindi, both of them silently realized that the version of love they had built online no longer existed inside that car. The following morning, Sarah made the decision to leave. There was no confrontation and no dramatic exchange, only acceptance that something fundamental had not aligned. Mwangi stood aside as she prepared to depart, watching quietly as the moment approached its end. There was no embrace that could repair what had shifted, no final words that could fully explain what had gone wrong. She left as the morning light softened over Malindi, disappearing into the distance. Mwangi remained where he was for a long time, still processing the experience. Eventually, he opened his phone and looked at the long history of messages they had shared over 6 months. Then, without hesitation, he deleted it all. Because some connections exist only in specific worlds, and when those worlds collide in reality, not everything survives. In the end, not every connection that feels real online is meant to survive in the real world. Some relationships are built on distance, imagination, and carefully selected moments that never fully reflect everyday life. When those worlds finally meet, differences in culture, expectations, and understanding can quietly unravel what once felt unbreakable. What remains is often not anger or blame, but a simple realization that connection alone is not always enough to bridge two completely different ways of seeing life.